Hello and welcome to this 10-minute talk on professional services issues. Today we're going to be talking about leadership issues. My name is Zulon Begum and I'm a partner at CM Murray, and I specialise in advising professional services firms on partnership matters, especially governance and partnership agreements and mergers and acquisitions. So, our airwaves and headlines have been recently dominated by the Conservative leadership election and the essential qualities that are required of a leader, and how do you choose the right leader? And many of these issues will be very familiar to professional services firms, which is why we thought it would be really interesting to kind of have a chat about these issues that normally face professional services firms. And I'm really pleased to have with me today Dr Henry Marsden, Managing Partner of Professional Services Firms International. And Henry works with firms in an advisory capacity, and his work focuses on supporting partner conferences, leadership development programs, and succession issues. Henry, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Hi, Zulon, it's a pleasure, and thank you for asking me along.
So in your kind of experience, the Conservative Party leadership election obviously kicked off with quite a crowded field of candidates with varying degrees of skill and experience and prospects of success. It's interesting that the final two in the leadership race are or were very recently senior cabinet members. Do you also find in your experience that managing partners in professional services firms are usually drawn from the existing leadership team? And do you think that's actually a good thing? Does that narrow the field too much, do you think?
Well, if I start with the latter, I think it is a good thing if the person who's then going to go on and run a firm has had significant leadership experience. I think there's a huge number of people who stand for managing partner roles who kind of really don't know how the firm works, if I put it that way. They don't see the annual cycle, the budget cycle, the strategic cycle. So I think it's always a really good thing to have an experienced leader coming into what are big businesses now with some sense of how their firm works internally. So for me, I think it's really good that they've had that time in senior positions within their organizations to do it. I think, like you say, there's always a bit of, are they part of the old history? And therefore, will they be the same again candidate, or will there be somebody else who comes from outside? But that's often the challenge, isn't it, with partnerships? If you have that system which actually says any partner can choose to stand and anybody can come forward, you often have quite a diverse range of people who think, well, this is my time perhaps, and I'm passionate about something. But not many of them know how their firm actually works, is my shorthand. I don't know if you've had the same experience. You know, they have a bit of a picture about how they think it should work and are passionate about some of the things that they think don't work at the moment. But that's often not as straightforward as then going on to lead what are multi-million pound businesses these days, which take time to turn, patience to run, have many other competing priorities.
The vast majority of the firms that we work with, certainly the partners, the managing partners, senior partners in those firms will normally be drawn from their existing partnership, and those partners will have had some experience of already managing key departments and being on the board itself before they step into that the leadership role of managing partner. But increasingly, I'm also seeing some firms looking outside of their partnership altogether, and maybe even if you're a law firm looking for a non-lawyer, so an experienced CEO type person who can bring a different perspective to the firm. Are you seeing any of that going on in some of your clients as well?
I think lots of people are thinking about it. And for me, the question is there's some granularity in between, is it COO or is it proper chief exec? There are people who can run finance functions and support infrastructure and start to be strategic in some way as a COO alongside a managing partner model. And I'm seeing some people start to think that their next iteration might be to have a chief exec running the business. But part of me would feel quite sad about that. I think having worked with other industries and sectors, I think it's nice to have somebody from the profession who sits in that managing partner chair and leads it, and maybe works with professionalizing with the COO. But I just think there's something about wanting to run your own firm, keeping it in that ecosystem that actually I quite like personally.
Certainly, I often see outside influences coming in the form of non-executive directors rather than the managing partner. So there is an element of external influence there to bring a different perspective. But you're right, many professions actually, rightly or wrongly, I think, like to kind of appoint a leader who they know and trust already, who's been around in the business and knows how things works and how the partnership ticks over. So I think you're absolutely right there. Again, we're seeing with the transition in leadership of our political of our government and political leaders, the difficulties in transition, and it hasn't been an easy one for the Conservative Party, certainly. It can certainly also be a difficult period for professional services firms when they're transitioning from, especially a long-standing leader to a new leader, and it can create a period of uncertainty and instability for the firm, especially if it opens up different factions within the firm who are vying for their candidates to be appointed. So once a candidate is chosen, what do you think the firm should as a whole be doing at the board, executive and operational level to ensure that partner is successful as possible?
For me, planning should start really early. So I think sometimes it's the elections that hold very close, very quick, without much preparation by the senior partner or the board and overseeing them, that often have these greatest concerns, because everybody rushes to one outcome and then the phases aren't really planned. So we haven't really had to think about, well, how are we going to get diverse candidates to want to stand? How do we then get them ready to be good at the job? And then also what then will happen in an election process and what's the tone to be set? Because a lot of factions are often, how do I put it? I mean, they're often there for a reason, because candidates come with different support packages, as you're seeing within the Conservative election. And that's a good thing, but they kind of need not to undermine each other on that process. So there's lots that senior partners can do to sort of bring those candidates together, control the hustings, minimize any fallout from the relationships that happen. You can't always preempt it all, but you can do a lot to minimize the impact of those fallouts going through. And then also ensure there's a really well thought through transition plan between the current incumbent and the person that's taking up the reins, because they'll have to exit their practice usually, so there's lots of getting out of things as well as getting into things. But also they might be appointed with doing things that are very different to the incumbent. So the incumbent might say, well, actually, I don't really want a long handover. It's not something that I think I can agree with and therefore move on with. So a lot of it is very dependent on when you actually know the outcome, what's the right handover process for that pair of people, with a crucial role for the chair or the senior partner, rather than sort of let's just see what happens and get on with it. So for me, there's a lot of planning, a lot of role for the board, a lot of supervision that can be done, lots of important parts of the chair. Really, really key role that I think in these transition and handover periods, because it can get quite messy.
And do you think that can also be achieved, especially if there's a sudden change in leadership, for whatever reason? I mean, in my kind of experience, I've had clients whose chief managing partners have had to step down because of various reasons, like ill health, for example.
Yeah.
So how can firms prepare for that type of transition where it is a very sudden change?
I've probably got a vested interest in this, Zulon. So I'm a big believer in leadership development. So I think you always need a pool of leaders capable of taking on the job. And I think if you just leave it to the elections and see what happens, and you haven't developed either a sense of who the next people are going to be, or have laid development programs in place that actually help them think about whether this is their time and to go forward, I think you risk a big gap in terms of those short things. And again, the best firms I see, have a list at the board. They have a reserve person. It's really clear, like Dominic Raab stepped in with Boris when he was with COVID. There is always a sense of a plan as to who will step into those positions at the moment at short notice, while we then do an election or they see through their term. So again, lots of responsibility for the senior partner or the board to make sure that those things are actually in place in the governance sense.
I completely agree. And certainly when I'm drafting governance provisions in partnership agreements, it's something I always urge my clients to consider as to what happens if there is a sudden kind of change with the managing partner or a senior partner or other key individual. How can the rest of the organization step into those kind of shoes and those rights and obligations of that person under the partnership agreement, and how can that person eventually be replaced and very quickly? So, the normal transition, if a term of managing partner ends, you normally have in your agreement a whole nomination and election process, and that can be too long-winded, especially if there's a sudden change of leadership. So you need to be able to anticipate that in your partnership agreement. So I completely agree with you on that. So the last question, Henry, I was going to ask you was in terms of choosing your managing partner or senior partner. Most firms have some type of election process, and normally will be preceded by a nomination process, like we've seen with the Conservative Party, where quite a wild field of candidates. I think they started with about 11, have been whittled down to 2. What kind of process do you think works quite well in professional services, and what kind of processes do you think? Because I think the danger is, as with any type of election, that it becomes a popularity contest, that the most popular person might win, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the most capable person to do that job.
I think with those firms that have reached scale, I think there's a real challenge around charismatic leaders who can't do the job. And I think, like you say, it's that popularity. So again, I think a lot of what those organizations are looking at is what's the board's role in creating something. They can't always, so some firms have got board appointed managing partners. So it is the board's job to appoint the next chief exec. And I think as firms grow, that's going to become an increasingly important question. Do we elect our board members to appoint our chief exec rather than have a hustings of all the partners to pick that position? I think it's a really interesting question, that one, about are we going to get on that corporate route of organisation where it's the board's job, the chairman's job, to appoint the chief exec? But I suppose the way I think they should be holding their duties is to say, well, look, are we happy as a board that this candidate can do the job and has no risks or reputational damage that they might cause to be put forward into an election process? So I'm starting to see some firms really think hard about the due diligence, into the candidates. Is there anything that the board needs to know about them in not necessarily a formal reporting process, but also in an assessment process? So using things like corporate boards do, like psychometrics, business psychology interviewing, those sorts of things where we can get another leg to the stool of the decision, alongside their internal reputation, their experience, whether or not that's a good fit. Actually, have they thought themselves about leadership positions, and have they thought about why they want to do this, and if they're suited to it, or where they need some help or a team around them on those aspects of leadership where they might struggle. So increasingly, I find it's evolving. It's quite fun at the moment. Lots of people having lots of new conversations about this, and a lot of it is new because law firms have not been that big in the past, so there isn't a history to lean on. There's kind of a new behaviour to sort of work towards, which is quite fun at the moment. So I think there's lots of that nuanced space about board responsibility relative to the right to the partnership deed to hold an election, if that makes sense.
It completely makes sense, and I agree with you on all those points, really. There needs to be kind of a balance between making partners feel that they're enfranchised in the process of choosing a leader, but at the same time making sure that again, it doesn't become a complete popularity contest. And often when I advise firms on these governance arrangements in their partnership agreements, we'll talk through the kind of processes that you'll have to, the nomination process, and who exactly can be nominated. So sometimes firms will limit that to the most senior class of partners being eligible for nomination in the first place. So that you have the certainty that that person will become with a certain level of expertise and experience in the business, and from that, then you go through a kind of a whittling down process. Some firms will have some kind of French presidential type election process where, as we've seen with the Conservative Party leadership election as well, where you go through several rounds of voting if there's more than 2 candidates, so that the ultimate candidate has to achieve at least more than 50% of the vote in order to be elected. Some of the firms will just go for a simple vote where you say you have three candidates, whoever gets the majority. But the danger in that is that somebody can be elected, say, with 36% of the vote, which doesn't give them confidence that they've got the partnership behind them. Those are the types of issues that we kind of always kind of talk with our clients about, as to how best to approach these types of processes. And again, it will differ from firm to firm.
Lots of people have now seen the outcome of that multiple. I was chatting to one person, they said, no, we've got to go head to head because you need that mandate at the end of it. But then somebody else was telling me we actually only have an affirmatory vote. we walk the candidates around internally so much that it's just actually a bit of an affirmation, and sort of there is only one candidate put forward, but it's a nice moment when we don't risk splitting the firm. So there are many people tactics that underlie the voting process as well. There's so many fascinating things in this space for leaders to think through in terms of it, as well as actually, can they do the job? What is the job? I think the other bit that we sometimes get caught up in process of elections rather than actually saying, what do we need from a managing partner or chief exec in the next phase of our evolution? Do we need somebody with a ambitious strategy, who will see us through some very challenging times? Do we need somebody who can help us merge and lead in consolidation? And I think there's a lot of context as well as role, as well as personality that we're often navigating. What will the firm be doing in the next 5 years? Is the person suited to leadership positions, and how do we help them develop in that? Not everybody makes a perfect leader, but also what's the balance of authority we give them as a chief exec? Do they have a proper chief exec role and run the firm on behalf of a supervisory board, or does the supervisory board set strategy that they expect the chief exec to implement? So lots of things for firms to think through as they start to think about succession planning, development, role, and who will do this job well to see the firm through its next iteration. I think that's the key question. Yeah.
And with that, I think our 10 minutes are up, Henry. So I'm going to wrap up there and say a huge thank you for joining us for this really interesting chat. I've certainly kind of learnt a lot. And I hope people watching, listening have also enjoyed this session. If you have, please feel it would be lovely if you could like and share and subscribe to our channel. And hopefully you can join us for our next one very soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elon. Love to see you.